Let's go through my full Resident Evil collection. Now, the idea here isn't to own every version of every Resident Evil, it's just to be able to, if I chose to, play any of the Resident Evil games. The only one that I tried to collect every version for, because it became a little bit of a meme and I think it's kind of fun, is Resident Evil 4. So with that said, let's go through it. Okay, starting off with the PlayStation 1 games. First of all, I have the original Resident Evil. This is one that I am kind of tempted to get the director's cut for because it's kind of different and it would be kind of cool to expand my PlayStation 1 collection because I really don't have very many. The PlayStation 1 is a system that I'm typically not a big fan of actually playing because a lot of them don't feel so good actually going back to it. So the only games that I will typically play on PlayStation 1 or that I'm willing to play is Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 and also Silent Hill 1. Anyway, with that said, the next one we have is Resident Evil 2. I do believe that this actually came out the year that I was born, 1998, and I think that that is kind of a cool thought sometimes. I think it's always interesting to take a look at things that are the same age as me, because it's interesting that this exact case, like this physical one, not just the game itself, but this is probably as old as me. This is probably older. I don't know why, but I think age is kind of a cool thing. A few years ago, I went to Rome, and like standing in the Colosseum was so cool, like seeing all the old buildings. In a few weeks, I'm going to Florence, Italy, and I'm going to record like lots and lots of that. I'm going to travel vlogger style it, and yeah, you'll see. Anyway, I ramble a lot, I know, I'm sorry. Anyway, so that was Resident Evil 2. Next up, we've got Resident Evil 3. So Resident Evil 3 holds a bit of an interesting place in my heart due to the fact that I do believe that it was either the first or the second game I ever actually played as a kid. Granted, it would have come out when I was only a few years old. It was one of the games that my dad had on his PlayStation 1, and I remember playing it and being I remember even being terrified of Mr. Nemesis himself. Like, when I would open the drawer that contained the games to try to choose a game to play, I would actively try to not see Nemesis's face because it would be just too scary for me. So a few years ago when I finally went back and actually played through it and beat it, it was kind of a very satisfying moment to conquer something that the child version of me was afraid of. Anyway, after that we have a Resident Evil game that, to be real, I might not ever play because I don't think it's particularly well renowned. But we have Resident Evil Survivor. This is a light gun game, which I don't actually even own any light guns, and I kind of do want to get a light gun for the Wii, because I own a decent amount of light gun games between House of the Dead and a few of the Resident Evils. But yeah, that is Resident Evil Survivor. Okay, so now we move on to the PlayStation 2 era of Resident Evil games. I'm willing to bet that a lot of these games you've probably never heard of, probably never seen before, because I had never even heard of them. This was one that I only learnt existed when I made a video similar to this one over on TikTok where I talked about all the Resident Evil games that I own, under the presumption that I already owned them all, and Guy was like, actually, no, there's one more on the PlayStation 2. And because it's on the PlayStation 2, I couldn't forget about it. I couldn't just ignore it. And it was pretty expensive too. Like, I think I paid £60 for it. And I think CX are now selling it for about 70. This is the sort of case that would have spooked me as a kid as well. But this is Resident Evil Survivor 2, Code Veronica. I presume that you play through the story of Code Veronica in light gun mode, whereas the other one, well, I don't even know what the other one is. But anyway, next up, we have Resident Evil Outbreak and Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. I'd heard of them. I'm pretty sure that you play as like random ass NPCs, non-playable character sort of things in regular games, but here they are playable. I don't really know. Again, I don't think they're exactly well renowned, and that's why they've kind of been forgotten for time. Then next up we have the actual Code Veronica, or at least Code Veronica X. Again, I'm sure that there is a different version of Code Veronica that is the original one, but again, I'm not bothered about owning the Dreamcast or the GameCube versions of these games. It's just a case of I want to be able to play any of them if I was to play them physically. Even though in reality, to be real with you, a lot of these I'd probably emulate anyway, just because it would be a superior experience, especially with like Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3. But my rule behind emulation is that I will only emulate a game if I own it physically, just because, I don't know, it's a silly rule that I created in my head. I've got loads of silly rules. Also, apologies for the reflection, but it is 3 o'clock in the morning as I'm recording this, and those are my overhead spotlights. But you guys are used to them. They're almost like a character of these games. Next up, we have Resident Evil Dead Aim. I think this is another light gun game. I'm pretty sure. I don't know much else about it. But after that, we get into what you're all here for, something you are very aware of. Resident Evil 4, the Platinum Edition. This was actually my childhood copy of Resident Evil 4, the first version of Resident Evil 4 that I ever played. Little did I know that apparently this version of Resident Evil 4 is not as good as all of the other versions of Resident Evil 4. However, it was enough for me as a kid. I remember there was a dude on YouTube when I was 8 years old that I was watching. His name is Exelga, I think, and he did a playthrough of Resident Evil 4 on the Wii, and I watched him play through this, and yeah, that was a fun old time. Next up, we have the original version of Resident Evil 4 for the PlayStation 2. This one's from CEX, as is the next one. Again, this was just my trying to collect all of the different versions of Resident Evil 4 thing. So, yeah, PlayStation 2 version of Resident Evil 4. And then we have the limited edition Steelbook version of Resident Evil 4, which I do think is beginning to pick up in price. It's kind of interesting. Even has the manual, limited edition manual. Even the disc is a bit different. Ooh, the disc is actually kind of textured. I've never felt that before. You know, I really should check the discs a little bit more frequently when I buy games, because I almost never do. There's me. Hello, you can see the camera. But yeah, that disc looks pristine, thankfully. Anyway, that's all of my PlayStation 2 era Resident Evil games. So there's a bit of an interesting story here, but these are there are only 3, or at least I only have 3, PlayStation 3 Resident Evil games. Actually, that's a lie. I have 4 as of yesterday. The other one is... we'll go through that one first, I suppose. Here. So this one is from Japan. This is Biohazard Revival Selection. What this is a physical release of Resident Evil 4 for the PlayStation 3 and Code Veronica for the PlayStation 3. Like I said, it is completely Japanese. I presume that you can play it in English through the menu settings, but yeah, it was just me. It was me hunting down all of the different versions of Resident Evil 4 because I wanted to own them all. It's kind of just a cool thing to have. I'm not even sure if it would work, but I think the PlayStation 3 might be region-free, in which case it would. Speaking of not sure on things, but apparently the majority of you guys watching this video are not already subscribed, so if we could go ahead and fix that, that'd be pretty cool. Anyway, after that we have Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. Now, the keen-eyed among you may notice these are actually the American covers, because they have the ESRB age rating rather than PEGI. Now, the reason for that is because despite the fact... Hang on. Despite the fact that... Jesus Christ. Hang on. Doing this one-handed's harder than it thinks. Despite the fact that my disc is PAL and not American, these 2 games are part of my lineup of games that the cases got sun damaged for in my old house, and when I moved house I had to physically replace them. And I've yet to replace these 2 because I already own them on PlayStation 4, which we'll get to later. Speaking of which, the final PlayStation 3 Resident Evil game that I have, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. I don't think it's a particularly very good game, but yeah, I think that kind of goes for a lot of the Resident Evil games outside of the mainline ones, sadly. Okay, next up we have the PlayStation 4 Resident Evil games. The majority of these are actually remakes because almost all of them got remakes or re-releases. So first of all, we've got Resident Evil The Origins Collection, which is Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 remake. Interestingly, a lot of the Resident Evil games are stylized in lowercase, which is kind of strange, like even lowercase r and lowercase e. I have no idea why that is. I'm sure there's probably a story behind it. Anyway, that's Resident Evil Origins Collection. Then we have Resident Evil 2 Remake, which one of my favourite games that's ever been remade. Like, I think that Capcom are typically exceptional at remaking their games. I'm really hoping that that stays true with Dead Rising Remake in a few weeks or months or whenever that is. I will be playing it. But between the remakes of Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2 and 4, they have some of the best remakes that gaming has ever seen. However, that said, we do also have Resident Evil 3, which my version is a lot more expensive than I think it is now, sadly. This is kind of just a watered-down version of Resident Evil 2 Remake, isn't it? Like, I don't know why they backtracked a lot of the quality of it. One big thing that annoys me in it, and this is a very minor thing, but it's something that I quite enjoy in gaming, or at least I always have since I was a kid, is the gore. For some reason, they really toned back the gore in this game, and I'm not sure why. Anyway, after that, we have another Resident Evil 4, this one for the PlayStation 4. Then we have Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 in their true forms versus the NTSC versions of them I've got on PlayStation 3. Well, the cases anyway, the discs are UK. But again, this was me being stupid as well, actually. I already own all of the Resident Evil games that are available on PlayStation 4 digitally. The Origins Collection, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I even owned 7 on Xbox One, but I went out and rebought them all because I wanted the complete set on PlayStation 4 physically. it's a bit of a habit that I've got, so if that doesn't get you guys to like the video because I'm obsessed with collecting, I don't know what will. But yeah, so that's 5, and that's 6. And then we have Resident Evil 7, which, interestingly enough, is VR compatible, but it's a game that I've never played in VR. I have the Oculus Quest 2, which I don't think I could play Resident Evil on, unless Resident Evil 7 on PC has a VR version that is compatible with the Quest. I'm not sure about that, but Resident Evil 4 VR, which I do have as well, but obviously isn't a physical thing, is one of my favourite games that's ever released. Like, it's one of my favourite gaming experiences that I can think of in recent years. Like, if somebody asks me, what's the most fun you've had in gaming? The first thing at the minute that pops up in my head, because it's the most new, is Resident Evil 4 in VR. It's brilliant fun. But anyway, Resident Evil 7 is the return to form. It's the game that sort of fixed the franchise. Next up, I've never played either of these two, but apparently people consider them almost mainline game adjacent, which, is kind of odd to me. But anyway, we have Resident Evil Revelations HD, which I do believe is another remaster, and Resident Evil Revelations 2, which is apparently a box set. So maybe it was in that era of games where for some reason everything released episodically, because Telltale Games did it with Walking Dead, and that made a lot of money, so every game ever decided for a while that they needed to do it too. Which brings us on to PlayStation 5. And hey, as of the moment, there are only 2 Resident Evil games on the PlayStation 5 as far as I'm aware, with Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake. A lot of people ask, especially like younger people, what do I prefer, Resident Evil 4 Remake or the original? And I think both are excellent games, but both are very different games. I don't think one can replace the other. I also have the Steelbook version of Resident Evil 4 Remake as well, because I think it's cool. But yeah, I think that it's just another way to experience Resident Evil 4. I think Resident Evil 4 is one of those magical games where there's just that many different ways to experience the same thing that it's actually kind of cool. Like, you can play Resident Evil 4 on its mainline console editions, whether that be PS2, GameCube, PS3, PS4, the Steam edition, the traditional Resident Evil 4 experience that we all know. But then a very different experience to that is Resident Evil 4 on the Nintendo Wii, because of the motion controls, but that's a whole different thing. And then on top of that, you've also got the VR version, which again feels very different even still. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can play Resident Evil 4, whether it be the original release, whether it be the various different motion control versions, whether it be the PlayStation 5 remake. I think that all of them are valid and all of them are just perfect ways to do it. I think that, for example, when I do my Resident Evil playthroughs, I will play at least 3 different versions of Resident Evil 4 every time because they're all valid to me. I will play the original release on one of the consoles of my choice. I will play the VR version. I will play the remake because, yeah, they're all good. Anyway, to finish off my Resident Evil 4 collection, and Resident Evil collection as a whole, I suppose, we have Resident Evil 4 for the GameCube, Resident Evil 4 for PC. This is not the Steam edition, this is just the original release of the PC version, which I don't believe is very good because you have to play it with mouse and keyboard and it's not very cool. It might even be keyboard only, I think that might be a thing. But yeah, I can't even play this one if I wanted to because my PC doesn't have a disc drive. It's just for the sake of having yet another Resident Evil 4 to talk about and show in videos and own and think it's cool. Then, before we move on to the final Resident Evil 4, which you've already seen to be fair, but we're on to the Wii stuff now. There's 3 Wii games for Resident Evil. We have Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles, Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles, and of course, Resident Evil The Wii Edition. Dark Side Chronicles and Umbrella Chronicles, I do believe, are both light gun games. So again, I don't own a light gun, but I think it'd be interesting to get one. I hope they work as accurately as I want them to, otherwise it would not be very fun. But yeah, I am curious to see just how many Resident Evil games that is, because it is quite the pile, isn't it? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, because there's 2 in there. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. So I have 34 Resident Evil games there, which is pretty cool. Now, the very nerdy and keen-eyed among you might realise there is actually one Resident Evil game missing from my collection that has a physical release. Granted, over the years there have been a few digital-only Resident Evil games that are typically online affairs that nobody actually liked. Umbrella Corps for one of them. But in terms of Resident Evil games that ever actually saw a physical release, I'm currently missing just one, and I'm not entirely bothered about getting it because it's not exactly something that displays very well, being as that it's a Game Boy game called Resident Evil Gaiden. If I would ever, for some magical reason, be able to get a physical case for it, maybe I'd get a reproduction case and buy the actual cartridge on its own, but I'm pretty sure it's a pretty expensive game now that goes for more than at least £100, and I'm typically not in the market for spending that much money on a game unless it's something that's actually capable of being displayed. Yeah, because Game Boy games typically just get put in my Game Boy pouch. So probably never going to own that one, or at least not unless something silly happens or somebody like offers it to me or anything like that. I don't know. I'm not exactly in a hurry to get that one. But yeah, that is my entire Resident Evil collection. It was kind of fun to talk about these games a little bit more in depth than I normally would. Typically on TikTok, when I do these videos about my whole collection, I just like say the name of the game and say that I own it, whereas here it's like my history with the game. For example, with Resident Evil 5, it was one of the first one of the first games that I ever played online. I remember back in the day when I was like in year 7, when I was like 12, there was this one dude that I'd play every single day with, and I think we beat the game together. I never learned his real name. His name was Mackie D, or at least his username was. Being as I'm 26 now and he was probably about the same age as me, he might be married with children now. But yeah, nostalgic times. Resident Evil 4 was the first Resident Evil game that I ever beat. I've got a bit of a weird memory in that I tend to not really forget things very easily, so like I will often attach like things to memories. So like I said with Resident Evil 3 and being afraid of the front cover, like I said with Resident Evil 2 and being it coming out the year I was born, not exactly a memory but something kind of cool. Resident Evil 4 being one of the first Let's Plays that I ever watched on YouTube with that guy Exelga, the Platinum Edition being the first version of it that I ever owned. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that is my Resident Evil collection. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and maybe I'll do the same thing with other franchises at some point too, because I try to do this with just about every franchise that I have. Like, it is very rare that I will allow a franchise to go incomplete in terms of entries, just because it annoys me if I don't have them all when I look at them on the shelf. So, yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Drop a like if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you later.